Okay, good. Thank you. So, first of all, let me welcome all of you and everyone in virtual mode on Zoom to this flagship dialogue on the future of Asian economic growth. Now, to my mind, this is extremely important because I've said this often for the last 3 years or so, 4 years or so, that the relative growth of Europe and North America is really going down. For the foreseeable future, the World Bank in its most recent output has confirmed that, and of course, in the more short term, so does IMF. And what is most important for the world is that Asian economic growth should continue to be much higher than the rest of the world. Of course, at perhaps a lower growth rate than it has been in the last 30, 40 years. And by Asia, I mean ASEAN plus China plus Korea and Japan, that is ASEAN plus three, all of South Asia as well. So that this region comprises of about 4 billion people. And most projections suggest that um, within a few years, this region will have at least half the world's GDP, if not higher, and similarly, more than half the global trade, if not higher. Therefore, the future of Asian economic growth is extremely important. Now, Simon, let me first now introduce our speaker and book writer, Simon Commander, with a very commanding presence that you have. So, he is the managing partner of Altura Partners, which provides advice to governments and companies in emerging economies. And so, to some extent, Asian economic growth is in your hands since you're presumably advising them. He's he his he graduated from BA from Oxford, and then shifted allegiance to Cambridge University for his PhD. And he was stuck in the World Bank for about 15 years. Was it immediately after that, or after? Much later? Okay. And then also at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development (EBRD), where he worked for 13 years or something. Right. He also worked. He also taught at the IE Business School in Madrid. He's had a number of books and with an amazingly wide range of subjects. Before this one, I think the most recent one, or I'm not sure about that, was the software industry in emerging markets. It was 2005. The state of agricultural development in Egypt since 1973. So you can see software, agriculture, enterprise restructuring, economic policy in Russia. So you're responsible for what's happening there now. Then structural adjustment and agriculture in Africa and Latin America. So really a very wide spectrum of interests in actual research and writing. So so we are really very, very fortunate to have you speak on the connections world. And your co-author is Saul Leston, right? Let me also introduce discussant Shivshankar Menon. Of course, his biggest job has been as Distinguished Fellow of CSEP, but he also spent some of his time as visiting professor at Ashoka University now. And of course, he served as a National Security Advisor to the Prime Minister of India 2010 to 14, Foreign Secretary of India 2006 to 9, and of course Ambassador to China and other places. He's also currently the Chairman of the Advisory Board of the Institute of Chinese Studies in Delhi. He's also an author of a number of books, most recent ones being India and Asian Geopolitics, so he's obviously totally qualified for this session, and Chairman of the Advisory Board, another book, Choices Inside the Making of Indian Foreign Policy. you're throwing some cold water on the future of Asian economic growth. There, so there you go.
Okay. So, firstly, thank you very much, Rakesh, for inviting me, and to Shankar as well for the invitation and for being the discussant. The book that Rakesh referred to is this, The Connections World, which I wrote recently with Saul Estrian, an old friend and professor at LSE. And it came out, it's published by Cambridge. Cambridge University Press are a splendid organization, but completely immune to any commercial imperatives. So I would normally have got them to come and try and sell a few books, but that would be beneath their dignity, I think. So if anyone really wants to buy it or finds it interesting, I have to say, perhaps sadly, you're best off going to Amazon. Now, on that...
We also don't allow any sales here.
Ah, okay, well, that's fine then. Cambridge would approve of you, I think. Anyhow, look, the book actually owes its origins to the last 10 years of working primarily in Asia, and in a way also to COVID, because as we know, in March 2020, it sort of came along, or traveling stopped, we got stuck at home, and there was nothing better to do than to write a book, and no excuses to be made for not doing it. So this is the result, and I'm really very thrilled to be back here in Delhi and looking forward to the discussion, and I suspect some argument, and I love argument, and I think the book hopefully deserves argument. So let me get down to really what the themes of the book are and the main issues and arguments that it makes. So we decided not to be small-minded about things. We'd ask a bold question: where's Asia heading? On the basis of where it's come from, more of the same, an argument, for instance, that's been put forward by people like Justin Lin, or in directions that will need to change. And the book tries to answer these quite bold issues. Now, we do it by not really just looking in a sort of standard economicsy way at the sources of growth, the decomposition of those sources and the like, but by picking up on what we found to be a common attribute right across Asia, cutting across systems at different levels of income and different sorts of political arrangements, authoritarian, democratic, sort of qualified democratic, and so on, but all of which had very similar features. And those features are, one, the importance of relationships and networks running between politics and politicians and businesses. And secondly, the way in which those relationships play out in the business space. So it's not just a question of politicians being linked up with a particular business, it's the form and structure of those businesses themselves. And the salient difference that stands out, at least from the UK, for example, or much of the so-called rich world, and by the way, much of the so-called developing world too, is that in Asia we have these business groups. And the business groups are largely family run and based, and they are highly persistent and important. And this cuts across these political systems. And this is what is so fascinating. So just to put it in context, a country like Vietnam, still a one-party state, but essentially the drivers of economic growth in Vietnam are largely 3 or 4 family-run business groups, many of whom play off very close connections to government, but nevertheless also have their own imperatives. And one of the arguments we make is that a lot of the debate that has been taking place amongst economists and policy people about the relative weight of markets versus the state, the relative role of industrial policy as against simply liberalizing, a lot of that, we argue, really misses the mark. Because actually what's happening in Asia is that there is both tacit and explicit public policy that comes together, coordinates, and achieves, or has achieved, major results, major and important results. And that can be South Korea with its explicit industrial policy, but it can also be other countries, including perhaps India, where the industrial policy, if you want to call it that, is much more tacit. Now, in that framework, it is very clear that these networks of relationships, which I'll just come to and describe, have played quite a positive role. And after all, Asia's extraordinary growth and resilience and renaissance, really, the things that Rakesh alluded to just now, are testimony to that. So to argue that this sort of system is inefficient and generally bad news clearly would miss the mark completely. But the book argues rather that this form of organization and these range of policy levers that are being pulled will tend to have, in a sense, a lifespan of their own. And that looking forward, as we do in the book, these sorts of relationships may actually have features that are actually quite undesirable and less of a support to Asia's future prosperity and growth. And these networks of connections are what we summarize in the title of the book, The Connections World. And the connections world, I want to stress right from the outset, is not just about me knowing X as a politician or otherwise. It's not bilateral cronyism, which has been very well documented. It's much more pervasive and much more important than that. Okay, so what is the connections world made up of? Well, obviously, they're politicians, political parties and the like, and then they're businesses. And in particular in Asia, whether it's Indonesia, India, Vietnam or whatever, there are business groups. And their interactions are enormously transactional. Politicians want to have campaign contributions, maybe jobs, creation of jobs for their constituents at moments, all of the things that by and large you often see, by the way, in the UK or elsewhere. Some of those interactions are less desirable, they're more venal, but some of it is perfectly understandable. Now, what do firms look for? Well, firms look sometimes for protection from foreign or domestic competition. This has been a major feature in the last 50 years, perhaps a declining feature, but nevertheless one that's important. They look for subsidies, loans, bailouts, public sector contracts, and very important in India, of course, they look to get permits and licenses to do certain things. And that's not just in telecoms or in mining. There are lots of sectors that have that. And in this sort of connections world, it's not just about simple transacting. There's also a lot of reciprocity at work, and we document that. And that's in and of itself quite interesting and goes way beyond the narrow interests of a social anthropologist, say. Okay, now networks, which I'm just going to quickly document, tend to come together with common purpose and ways of operating that cuts across political systems and geographies. Now, that's not to say that they aren't heavily influenced by the political system and the institutional arrangements. So China and Vietnam, as I've already mentioned, one-party states. So much of the centrality in the network, the central positions that players occupy in it, obviously flows to the political party, the unique political party. And therefore, there is much more concentrated. That's also true in countries that are not explicitly authoritarian in the same way or unique party. So for instance, in Philippines and also in your neighbor, in Pakistan, the strategic central nature of relatively few players is much greater than it is in many of the other countries. And that in the book we actually use to try and explain why those economies have done much less well than others. So we actually argue that the intensity of connections and the fact that in, say, the Philippines, 6 or 7 family-owned businesses, business groups, occupy most of the strategic space, actually holds back the performance of the economy. So it's the nature of how the network's configured that affects whether it is positive or less than positive for growth and other things. The important other feature, of course, is that if we'd roll back the clock 40, 50 years ago, most of the connections would have run between politicians or political parties and state-owned enterprises or parastatals. Well, that's changed enormously, whether through privatization or whether just simply through the entry of private players. So let's look at this. And these quite interesting network maps, which we generate from a data set that we use in the book, basically describe the relationships, just simply by the degree to which they're connected, of politics, politicians, private firms, the green, state-owned enterprises, and private individuals. And no prizes for understanding which is China and which is India. So in China, the unique party, everything radiating out like a cyclops eye, and there around it a bunch of companies, the blue, state-owned enterprises, for sure, they have a lot, but also a lot of the green, private companies and private individuals. And this is true right throughout Asia. In the network space, you get more and more private players, whether individuals or companies and the like. And just to be clear, the way those maps are measured is the size is given, is scaled by the number of connections that run off each node. So each node is the same size ab initio at the start, but then it's scaled up according to the number of connections. And beneath that, you will be able to see who's connected to whom. And in the book, we also discuss who has a central location in the network as against those that don't. Now, when we say go back, I beg your pardon, when we go back to that map, as I mentioned, many of those companies, the green, are private businesses. But as I mentioned before, most of those private businesses are actually parts of business groups. And business groups, to be clear, there's a long literature, by people working in this area and outside of it about Asian business groups. They're not the same as OECD conglomerates. They are business groups in bits of Europe and in bits of Latin America and the like, but they are a minority sport and a declining sport, shall we say. Asian business groups are largely family-dominated. They're often dynastic, and there are plenty of Indian examples, whether it be Tata in some form or Birla or the others. They're mostly very diversified. They really do an awful lot of things, quite often through a large number of subsidiaries as well. I'll come to that in a way. And the most interesting, well, perhaps the most interesting thing, they really hang around. They're terribly persistent. So if you even look at a country like Indonesia, which has been through a great political revolution, the ousting of Suharto and the like, most of the business groups that were formed in the Suharto period are major players to this day. Almost none of them have been dislodged in any material form. So once they get in, these structures tend to hang around. We've got to ask ourselves why. Well, one of the reasons why is they tend to be organized in pyramids. And that allows the owners, normally the families, far higher degrees of control than their actual levels of ownership. So they leverage it. By the way, this is not just an Asian thing. There's a nice article in the FT today describing one of the Wallenberg's annoyance at, I think, a hedge fund trying to address the AB share structure that exists in Sweden. But the AB share structure is exactly for this purpose as well. So it's not just unique to Asia, but the scale in Asia is unique. Minority shareholders almost always get a bad ride. They tend to be structures that are extremely suitable for tunneling, and owners just move them around. And of course, the accounting and the other governance type aspects tend to be both obscure and unhelpful. at least unhelpful to understanding what is really going on. And the final point we make is that these business groups are really very useful for deterring predators. And what do I mean by predators? It might be a politician who, change of government, wants to go after them. They don't probably even know quite where to start. It also helps deter other businesses from trying to acquire them hostilely or otherwise. Now, why are these business groups around, and why indeed are they so persistent? Well, the general argument was that they came into existence when capital markets were undeveloped, they were thin markets. When managerial markets were undeveloped, they were thin. Probably no accident that Tata's set up a very good administrative cadre fairly early on in existence. But I think all of us know very well that right through Asia, with few exceptions, these sort of missing and incomplete markets are far less missing and far less incomplete now than they were. And the arguments for trying to internalize everything in the business group are much less pressing, both in theoretical and in practical terms. And yet, business groups, if anything, have grown in scale and importance. So the argument that they're there to address missing or incomplete markets really doesn't strike home on closer observance. We argue in the book that business groups persist for a variety of reasons, one of which is that they are just immensely useful in the connections world. And they're not just useful for the owners, but they're useful for the politicians. If I want to influence the economy, it's much easier if I get hold of 5 or 6 owners of business groups and talk to them or transact with them in some form or the other. And they can be used also, by that token, for national or developmental goals. Now, that can be both real and it can be also misrepresented, as some of the discussion about the Adani Group's situation in recent times clearly shows. Now, not only do they hang around, persist, but they're also tremendous vehicles for the accumulation of business power, which I'm going to talk about primarily in terms of concentration, and wealth. Just to put it in the slides, by the way, the slides are available for anyone who wants them. Please, I'm sure the organizers will send them out if you do want them. And in that pair of slides, you have, for instance, the number of billionaires between 2000, 2008 and 2020 in Asia, disaggregated by country. And it is really quite astounding. But just between 2008 and 2020 in China, the number of billionaires increased 8-fold, and in India, in the same period, it more than doubled. And even in places like Vietnam, you see it. And perhaps the most striking case is probably from the most dynamic economy of the region, South Korea, where Samsung and the family that owns Samsung now account for about 22% of South Korea's GDP. Their wealth is massive, and the son of Samsung's founder, who died a couple of years ago, left an estate in excess of 21 billion. And that matters, as I'll show shortly, in terms of the types of policy one might want to apply to deal with these things. Now, the argument is that the connections world, coordination, bringing together resources, working across a range of sectors has not been a barrier to growth. That's absolutely clear. But it has created certain features which will be a barrier to growth if unaddressed. And one of them is the attenuation of competition, which in turn constrains productivity. The second is the limitation in the creation of good jobs and the perpetuation of duality in the labor market, massive perpetuation, as true, by the way, in China as it is in India. And thirdly, which is very important, we argue that this is not a good framework for really boosting broad-based innovation. There are other features that are up there on the slides which also are perhaps not too desirable. Okay, attenuation of competition. And I'm going to move at some speed now. Look, in general, these business groups, not all, but most, nor the politicians to whom they're often connected, really have any interest in allowing competitors to enter, unless they bring new technologies, in which case they often are allowed in, but often on terms that aren't necessarily particularly, are at least ring-fenced. Entry barriers for new firms are consequently high. So entry and exit, the sort of dynamics, the churning that you see in most dynamic economies is much less throughout Asia. And the exit by poorly performing or inefficient firms, notably firms within the business groups, is always, is not only much lower, but is often retarded or held back by intragroup financial transfers and other mechanisms, many of which are very opaque as well. Now, competition is hard to measure in Asia, I tell you, and we're doing some more research on this. I mean, when you think about competition, you really want to look at concentration, you want to look at profits, and you want to look at consumer prices. And the last two are extremely difficult to do at any level of adequate disaggregation. So for the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to stick with concentration ratios, CRs. So on the left, there's CR5, on the right is CR10s. And the comparator, for what it's worth, in there is the US. Now, we know, of course, that the US has seen an enormous growth in market power in particular sectors. And the live debate, whether in Europe or in the US, is what should be done for competition policy to deal with the Googles and Apples of this world. But at the level of the economy as a whole, bearing in mind how large that economy is, the CR5 for the US is no more than about 3%. And what does that mean is the revenues of the 5 largest firms in the US account for no more than 3% of national income, of GDP. Now look at what happens in Asia. In Vietnam, the CR5, CR10 ranges between in excess of 30 to 40+%. It's also very high in South Korea and Thailand. And in the 2 massive economies, India, China, it ranges between about 10 and 15%. So even in here, these concentration ratios are high. But in the other smaller economies, they are staggeringly high. Yep. So in South Korea, as you can see, the CR10 is north of 40%. That's quite extraordinary. Now, if there's lots of concentration, what happens with employment? Look, anyone at all conversant with Asian history, go back to Nehru, for instance, in this country, and what was some of the main objectives of the first governments after independence? Well, there were creation of jobs and incomes and basically dealing with pervasive informality. Well, sad to say, that's probably been Asia's greatest failure so far. On aggregate, labour productivity is still only about 10 to 15% of advanced economy levels. And although jobs have been created, most of those jobs are being created in the informal sector. They're poorly paid, they're low productivity, and they're highly precarious. And the business groups create certainly very good and often very productive jobs, but just in very, very limited numbers. And this is also reflected in the firm size structure, which is very important. So you have it's like a pyramid. You have a very small chunk up at the top of large firms, mostly business group firms. You have pretty much a missing middle, very few middle-sized firms, and then a great chunk of small and not very good firms or informal firms. And that is the mnemonic of the concentration. So the two go hand in hand, and I would say, looking forward, this is something that is potentially very dangerous indeed. Now, coming to innovation. Look, there is scope for more extensive growth. In other words, great applications of capital and labour driving the economy. There's no doubt that that's true in this country and in some other bits. But in China, much less so, and certainly much less so in Malaysia and a few of the other richer economies of the region. So it's very clear that Asia is going to have to pivot towards greater innovation. Now, what does this world of connections and preference and business groups do for innovation? Well, in the book, we argue that this is actually quite ambiguous. It's not as if there's a good story and a bad story. There are no bad guys here. It is quite ambiguous. You can, for example, Rakesh and I were talking over lunch about this. If you have monopolistic competition, you can have plenty of innovation because the few players in the game might be, going neck and neck with each other, might be spurred to innovate. So that's positive. Business groups, by attracting more resources from government, from banks and the like, may also similarly have incentives to innovate. After all, why not if you can get that? And pyramidal structures don't necessarily act against innovation. After all, if family owners can move it around, maybe they can allocate it in ways that may be not first best, but not necessarily that suboptimal. But on the other hand, they can also move resources around to bail out poorly performing firms or other pet projects and the like. So, yes, I will be done. Yeah, definitely. And then there are other factors like market power and political connections, which simply promote rent seeking. That's the classical argument, and that certainly is prevalent in some of these economies. And finally, the lack of churning entry-exit, which we think of as being an important feature of innovation economies, innovation-driven economies, is certainly absent. Okay, now on the point about BGs and innovation, the evidence that we refer to in the book and in some subsequent papers that we've published, basically business groups or their affiliates innovate more than others. But that's no surprise. Certainly shouldn't be any surprise given what I've just described. What happens in aggregate? So how does this all play out at the level of the economy? Well, there are various indices like WIPO's Global Innovation Index, other measures about patents and the like. And to cut to the quick, there are two diagrams where this is one where we relate GDP per capita to R&D spending, controlling for the size of the economy. And to be quite frank, what you see is there's one massive positive outlier, South Korea, which does an awful lot of R&D, way more than would be predicted for its level of income, and the rest cluster around the fitted line and the confidence interval, and some fall, notably Indonesia, way below it. Now, R&D can be a bit of a black box, so you want to ask, what is the efficiency of the R&D? So we relate that to the so-called quality of patents. So in other words, it's not just domestic patents, because if you did that for China, then China would look to be outstandingly innovative. Actually, most of those patents are not worth the paper they're written on, and most of them actually are posted but not granted, so even more problems. But high-quality patents are patents that are filed both at home and abroad. In other words, they incur costs, and they're filed in jurisdictions where anyone filing them would expect some significant payback to them. And again, you see that South Korea sits way up there, outside of the range, and China sits way below. So the long and the short of it is that although business groups may innovate more than others, on aggregate, Asia is not, I think, as innovative as we might have predicted. Okay, what are the prospects? And I'll come to a halt in a couple of minutes. Look, the connections world we describe is not going to go anywhere by itself. Most of the players derive material and powerful benefits from it, and the logic of market entrenchment is extremely powerful. And high intensity of connections, as in the Philippines or in Pakistan, create particularly powerful obstacles to any change. So what can be done about it? So there are a whole bunch of policies, and I'm going to skip over most of them because they're ineffectual, essentially. corporate governance changes. They're all desirable, but they're mostly skirted around. Prohibitions. The South Koreans have tried endless numbers of prohibitions on cross-holdings, on pyramids, numbers of subsidiaries, prohibiting banks, financial and non-financial entities to be in the same group, and so on and so on. Only Israel in the last 10 years seems to have made some progress in that way. Now, taxation is another matter. Here there is much more potential. Now, taxing dividends, which is something that is often cited as being a good policy, doesn't really make much sense in our view, not least of all because most business groups actually don't use dividends for intergroup transfers. Additional tax liabilities conditioned on the business group format seem to me to have much more potential. And the last point I want to make, which has the most potential and which was initially made operational in Japan and in the last 5 years in South Korea, is the introduction of estate or inheritance taxes. And it is actually this that has led the current Samsung chairman to actually announce that none of his children will manage the company in the future, and several other chaebols, including Hanjin, for instance, which owns Korean Air, amongst others, faced with very substantial inheritance tax liabilities, have also moved away from family ownership. So there's a great deal of potential in there. Then competition policy, obviously this is. Now, this is really very difficult. Most of the competition agencies are captured, weak, technically not very good, but they also focus in afraid, I think, a completely, in a very partial way, as in Europe and in America. They look at market power in particular sectors or activities. And our argument in the book is that's very important if you can get it to work, but you need also to look at market power at the level of the economy as a whole. And that is something that I think has potential to be useful. In terms of putting pressure on politicians to desist from leveraging networks, that's really very, very difficult indeed. There are lots of proposals. The World Bank makes a living, as it were, intellectually out of proposing solutions which never get adopted, not because they're not good solutions, but because they run into really very difficult feasibility conditions. We list some of them there. And I think at that point, I hope this has opened up what we've argued in the book and at least provoked your interest. So thank you very much for listening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon. It's always very difficult for an author of a book to summarize it in as short a time as you have, because obviously there must be much more in your mind that you wanted to tell us. So thank you very much for doing that so succinctly. Shankar, all yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Simon. Thank you for giving us this book. And it's, as Rakesh said at the beginning, it's a very valuable book because it asks the right questions. It asks the big question, which is really going to affect our future in India. It's also, for me, as a complete layman, I did ancient India and Sanskrit, so to write a book which is clear on an economic subject, which a layman can read and at the end think that he's understood something. But what I'd like to do, therefore, is to try and broaden the lens a bit, because there's 3 things that I'd like to say and then open it up to a discussion. One thing that struck me reading the book is that you keep coming back to the informality of what actually happens in Asia, of the way these business groups work, the way you mentioned, for instance, that this hollows out both formal and informal institutions. And we see this increasingly in Asia, in China, certainly in India. You see rule by law rather than rule of law. You see the effect on institutions. You see, and as you say rightly, it's not enough to say markets are imperfect, and that's why these are compensating for that. But there is a converse point as well. I think we are, at least academically by disciplines, we and governments certainly believe that everything should be formal and brought into the formal sector. But it's that informality which explains India's or Asia's success to a considerable extent. If you think of just the effect on a European advanced country of removing 86% of the currency from circulation overnight, and how different that is from the actual effect in India. So for me, I think there's a risk here that because we use formal categories and we privilege formality, and we tend to miss what's actually. Look at Pakistan. If you look at the official figures, people should be dying on the streets, but that's not what you see. So for me, there's an analytical problem here where we don't take into account, or at least we don't have the means to understand the value of informality and what it actually does. And I think that's what these business groups, this connections world, actually does. In many ways, it uses that and has served Asia well. Which brings me to the second point, which is your conclusion that it will not serve Asia well in the future. And I think you argue that very, very well in the book. That assumes that and you ask this question yourself actually in the book, whether what exists in Asia is fundamentally different to what existed in rich countries at similar stages of development or income levels. And the third question that for me is what is the impact of the connections world on these big transnational global issues that we have today? Climate change, on biodiversity, on sustainability. I mean, what does this do? Because as you said, the connections world is persistent. These business groups have survived changes in government, changes in political systems, they've changed, fundamental economic changes in the nature of the global economy, and they're still at it. So shouldn't we then say, okay, this is a fact of life. How are they going to affect these big things in the future? So for me, these are the 3 or 4 big questions that the book throws up. My own sense is that the connections world, is it true only of Asia? I don't know. I've always been amazed at how quickly and how homogeneous actually the formation of opinion and analysis is in advanced societies. Like you look at after 9/11 in the US and the West, for instance, there was an immediate sort of coalescing of opinion. Ukraine's another example. It doesn't take long. And I've never understood how that happens. I can't believe that. Or you look at the role of, say, Goldman Sachs over time. Republican, Democrat doesn't seem to matter. So when we talk of this phenomenon of business groups and the nexus, is this uniquely Asian? I'm not so sure. I don't know. As I said, I'm a layman, I'm ignorant. But when I look at the issue, for me, this is a broader issue that I think is worth looking at. And if it's not unique to Asia, then we need to look at its explanatory utility a little more closely. So I would have loved in this book to see another whole section on comparing this Asian connections world with other similar societies at similar levels of income and development. But of course, that's asking you to kill the lily. It's already 256 pages. So that would be an unfair thing. But I'd better stop here. But thank you for writing this. One of the best parts for me was that it helped to break certain stereotypes and certain lazy habits of thinking that we all carry along. There's an extensive database there. And the one thing that proves is that rapid growth is not the prerogative of any political system. This is for those Indians who think we need to be more authoritarian and less democratic if we want to grow fast. Nor are there substantial effects from business group affiliation on financial performance in Asia in either direction, positive, negative. I mean, for me, this was, and as I said, as a layman, it's suddenly all these, there's a lot of shibboleths that you've managed to destroy in the course of writing this book. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Shankar. I think you've raised enough questions in your brief commentary for Simon's next book. If while you think of your questions, let me add a few more questions for your next book. Okay. One, that is it correct to talk about Asia? What is Asia? Given that the per capita incomes range from say around $2,000 or thereabouts, I don't remember what is Laos per capita income now, to Japan, which is about 50,000 or something of that order, Korea 40,000, China about 10 or 12,000. So how can all this be lumped into one lot? Okay, and what that raises the question is that when you're talking about this connections world, can't last, that it will not be a positive thing for very long. Okay, at what stage does that kick in? $2,000, $10,000, $20,000, $40,000, $50,000, or what? Because after all, the more successful economies, Japan, Korea, have gone to that level through the connections world, presumably, according to your book. And China seems to be, they may be slowing down now. Of course, Shankar knows much more China than I do, since he has lived and breathed China most of his life. But even though it may slow down, it's probably likely to go further. So that's one first question. Second, you talked about productivity still being 10 to 15% of advanced economies. I mean, that's obvious. Otherwise, their per capita income would be the same as advanced economies. So that doesn't impress me or interest me at all. The question is, in the last 20 years, has the productivity in Asian economies, or whichever Asian economies you care to take, been higher or lower than in the advanced economies, which in fact have been slowing down as far as productivity growth is concerned? And third, when the charts you give for comparability in the share of top 5 or top 10 companies, shouldn't it be size adjusted? So what if it took you, over lunch you mentioned Sweden, Denmark, Netherlands, Belgium, Switzerland, and after all UBS or Credit Suisse is about what, 50% of GDP or something like that. So I think that those are somewhat, if I may use a strong word, misleading charts in terms of contrasting the concentration. Obviously, the higher the GDP, you will have a lower share, I would presume, for the same size of company. Whereas if, as it happens, Netherlands, Switzerland in particular have very large companies. I'm not sure what is the case in Netherlands now with Shell having exited, but nonetheless in general, right? So I'm a bit curious about that as well. I have some other questions, but I think 3 is enough for your next book. Open. Yeah, yes. And just identify yourself, please.
My question is about, you mentioned about the competition policy, that typically the traditional competition policy focuses on sectors. And whereas in Asia, your assertion is that the business group competition is much more relevant. Are there any models elsewhere that you could think of, or what is the model that you would suggest in case the policymakers do want to, let's say, address this particular issue of competition at that level? Thank you.
Should I still use the mic? I mean, no, go ahead. Sorry. My name is Surinder Singh, and I did study economics in graduation, but I did my major in history, so that's where the question is coming from. if you look at the history of these businesses, the way they have worked, take a look at the Mughal Empire. This informality in all the Asian societies, or rather the Oriental way of doing things, has been the norm of the day. They form political connections. I mean, the empire, the economies, the mercantilism, and all of that comes in. So, if you take a look at the whole history of this part of the world, this is how it has been. Uh, so, where you see that when you see that the history is evident that it hasn't changed, it has obviously reformed itself and reinvented. Where do you think this line is drawn, as Mr. Menon was saying? And where would you suggest that there would be some new model for the budding politicians over here? This is what you're not supposed to do.
One more, then we'll ask him for answer, then we'll come back.
Hi, my name is Shishir Gupta. Fascinating topic, I must say, because we face this on a daily basis, right, in a country like India. I just have one question, which is, it's not clear to me from the presentation, what is the difference between connections world and corruption, right? And what we are taught, at least in economics, is that corruption is in the long run bad for growth. So how can so that is and one other thing is that in your slides, in the first few slides, you said that this world works by keeping competition down, etc. But from at least the Asian tiger story, etc., competition was promoted through reduction of tariffs, etc. So there is a bit of a confusion, at least in my head. But thank you for the topic.
Well, thank you to Shankar and Rakesh and to all. There are lots of things there, and I don't want to yak on too long, but I mean, this issue of informality, I think actually in the book we're using informality both in a sort of economicsy way, in other words, untaxed, unregulated and the like, and in a much broader way, which is how we connect. And I think and deal with each other and the sort of flexibility that arises, as you rightly point out. And I think the latter has obviously some very good and even desirable attributes to it. But the former doesn't have too many desirable attributes to it. And they are actually, I think, conceptually and empirically somewhat distinct. And, you know, after all, I mean, connections matter everywhere. I mean, if I want to try and get my child into a good university or whatever, I mean, no, in principle it's okay. But if I go and know the principal or something, I'll go and speak to them. It might have some effect. So that's a trivial example. So the sort of informality aspect, it cuts across these economies. But I think what we were doing was a bit narrower, was just really picking up the consequences primarily for employment, but also for business organization. And the employment thing, I mean, for many years I was sort of toiled as a labor economist, and Rakesh failed to mention my best books, which were about unemployment, so I'm going to tick you off for that. But
can't find it on Google.
Well, they're biased. No, I'm kidding. But I think really the big issue and where it comes together with the political economy is in the labour market. Because if these systems are very good at generating wealth and growth and dynamism, hallelujah, but if this spills down in such an incomplete way, and above all, if it spills down in an incomplete way in the types of jobs that are done and the wages and incomes that flow off those jobs, then I think it's potentially really very problematical. And I want to try and bring this back, I'm not sure this is totally coherent, to the point you also made, which is about what's happened in other parts of the world. And the example that has really come up in a lot of discussions about the book that we've had in the few months since it was published is actually Latin America. And several discussants have said, well, what about Latin America? There are family-owned business groups there. Well, as it happens, there are, but they're much less important than in Asia right now, and they've been declining. Why? Well, because most Latin American economies are so badly managed, they've inflated away, they're sort of, I mean, the addiction to what we call populism has eroded the base. But if you roll the clock back to between 1930s roughly and the late 1970s, what was the growth model in Argentina, Brazil, Colombia? It essentially was all these types of links and funding from government to family-owned businesses as the drivers. Now, that actually took their growth and their path very steeply upwards, but it ended in a crushing collapses. Why? Because I think the politics basically got in the way, because essentially it was a sort of oligarchic form of capitalism, and the way the politicians dealt with it was to essentially get elected on the basis that most of the population weren't getting material benefit out of it, and then use the budget to inflate, to drive their own things. And the consequences for the economies as a whole has been simply disastrous. And I fear that this will be an outcome in bits of Asia unless something is done about these arrangements. And I actually think you can even see the precursor of it, which was Shinawatра's short tenure in Thailand, irrespective of the fact that he was a massive beneficiary of connections and not the cleanest of the clean, shall we say. Nevertheless, the policies he and to some extent later his sister adopted had some smell of that, and I think this is the danger of these arrangements coming to bits. Now, on Rakesh's really interesting point, is there a level at which this all becomes dysfunctional and you switch gears? This, I think, well, I'm partly answered it a little bit like by what I've just said, but I just want to go back to South Korea, because South Korea, after all, is a damn sight richer than Spain and Portugal now. So it's a rich country. It's come from not much to something quite substantial in a very quick period of time. It's an utterly impressive case. It's very, but the nature of the country is such that it is enormously concentrated, as I showed there, irrespective of Rakesh's doubts about the concentration ratio as a measure. Essentially, the economy is dominated by about 5 business groups, and one in particular is approaching a quarter of national income. Now, how do you unpack that? Actually, most of the debate in South Korean policy circles is how, I mean, you don't want to kill the goose that lays the golden egg, because Samsung and others do. That goose is, well, this is stretching the metaphor a bit, it's a competitive goose, shall we say. It's not one that's being fatted up for domestic consumption, it has to compete in that. So it's an efficient goose. But it doesn't allow very much to grow in its shadow. And this is the great debate, how you can bring this about. So my answer to you is that I don't think there's any particular level at which this becomes particularly dysfunctional, but more to the point, as it becomes more and more entrenched, dealing with it in policy terms becomes more difficult. So I actually think there is more scope for dealing with market power and political privilege, political business privilege in India than there perhaps is in Korea. Because, you know, radical actions like breaking up the business groups, are unlikely to be done for the reasons I alluded to, but also because those actions can be highly, highly disruptive. If you started breaking up Samsung right now, I think the South Korean economy would really, really nosedive. So those are some of the issues. On Rakesh, I just want to clarify. You're absolutely right. Talk about Asia. I should have said at the outset, the book really is about what is sometimes rather stupidly called middle income Asia. We're actually not dealing with Laos or Cambodia or Nepal and the like. It's really about from lower middle to upper middle income Asia. And although we use Japan as an example in more cases than not, we aren't really dealing with Japan. So I think that there is huge heterogeneity, but there's much less than might have been implied if we lumped the whole sink in there. Yeah, your point about productivity, okay, that's the mnemonic of GDP per capita. So I grant you that. I'm using it as a sort of stylistic way of driving the point home. I think the CRs still are useful. Okay, yes, the US is a very, very big economy, so it doesn't really show up. But in Germany, if I put that number up, I think Germany probably would be about 7 or 8% for the CR5, something like that, because big companies and the Siemens of this world are much more important. So I'm not sure that I agree on that. Competition policy design, I think what I found was Israel was the most interesting. There's a very nice set of papers by a guy called Hamdani and a few other authors that you'll find on the web that describe both the Israeli government's breakup of some of the business groups and also attempts to limit market shares. I don't know whether that's been compromised by the current government and the like, but it certainly offered some potential. We gave this talk at the ADB, and Albert Park, who's the chief economist, they just had a meeting with a whole bunch of competition policy people, and he argued that there was an attempt to bolster the quality of these agencies, but frankly, the political will was almost entirely lacking. So you had fairly good technocrats, but you had very little support. Having said that, one of the reasons I got going on this book was I was working for quite a while in Indonesia, and honestly, the quality of Indonesian institutions is nothing to write home about. But the one institution that has somehow or the other, and I'm not quite sure how, is the Anti-Corruption Agency, which has got a lot of independent traction. And despite the attempts of some of the politicians to undermine it, is extremely effective. So it's not impossible to create these things, but they seem to be very, very idiosyncratic and not susceptible to a sort of harmonized interpretation, if you like. Yeah, is the connections world different for corruption and cronyism? I'd say corruption and cronyism are components of the connections world, but as we try and argue, the nature of these networks are far more overarching than just simply cronyism would summarize. After all, there's a tremendous book on China by Min Jinpei called China's Crony Capitalism, and that's mainly about how party officials and the like transact with businesses, and it's extremely valuable. But I think in some ways you might get more out of it analytically in policy terms from looking at it in this framework than simply looking at a set of bilateral relationships.
Thank you, Simon. Shankar, would you like to say something at this point? More questions? Anupam?
Yeah. So I have a couple of...
Anupam Khanna, you know.
Yes, we're friends.
Anupam Khanna. Yeah.
Hold on, microphone.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. So I have a couple of them segue from your own comment. My first question is Latin American corporatist state. You know, when you studied in history of industrial organization, you had the corporatist model in Latin America, and you compared it, for example, the Italian or the French business groups.
Yeah.
And in some ways, you're saying that this is somewhat similar to what is in Asia today, what was in the 30s. Question to you is it really? Because there is another big dimension which is different, the sociology, which is important for connections. It was East Asian countries, which I'm mainly talking about, are extremely homogeneous. When in Latin America, you had a very racially polarized economic situation. Secondly, this question about connections that is being used, you have, of course, described the connections as they have taken, you haven't really talked about the positive dimension of it.
Yes.
In fact, just the latest NBR paper, which talks about unpacking social capital, is basically saying a lot of it that has to do with connections.
Sure.
And we did the same. So another dimension of that I was going to say is Stiglitz's Wither Capitalism paper, where whether socialism, the Chinese and Russian models actually comes down to the nature of connections between the two. So have you looked at, the socialist societies, since you worked in EBRD? One question I have, methodological one, and I have a problem with one of your charts, the question of quality of R&D.
Yeah.
If you look at the three countries which fall below the line, are the three countries which are, I would say, dare say, the most doing the best by conventional wisdom in high tech. So you may have a compositional problem. You're saying Israel is bad, US is bad, and China is bad. I would say those are precisely the three countries where the type of R&D we are talking about, the performance is best. So, and I'm talking about quality of patents. And I think the difference there lies is because the patents are a very poor measure of. Okay. Lastly, and this has to do with the sociology one, you haven't had time perhaps, but I think in the end, have you looked at the nature of the interplay with political power? Most of your arguments is couched very much in terms of economic one. But actually the reason these things are entrenched and the way they play out in terms of economic policy, it has to do with the exercise of political power, and less, economic power facilitates that exercise. So those are four different questions.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, next to you, Anu.
Thank you. Nalin Kohli. So I am presenting a very micro perspective, not the macroeconomic one. I have, as a business in India, I used to buy components from South Korea, from one of the chaebols. And then we quickly shifted over to Taiwan, which is, there are no chaebols there. They are mainly small and medium enterprises. So you could probably influence the competition policy in a country, but in a global sense, it doesn't go beyond your own jurisdiction. So maybe your comments on that. The other thing where you talk about connections, and in our own context in India, we have started using a lot of IT in our decision making, where the connections have started losing that importance. A lot of things are happening. Take, for example, the startup situation. We have money which is given through a mechanism which is totally digitized. So what would be your observation, that is the digitization really, even in the Asian sense, breaking this connection bit?
I'm Rajesh Chadda from CSEP. I have a query and a question. The query is that 1 month ago in the same hall we had a discussion on the rise and fall of Brazil. So, given the context of connections, was there some element you discussed in between, but was there an element of that? And maybe corruption, because we just had it 1 month ago. My second question is regarding when we talk of the future of Asian economic growth, apart from connections, I think what we are seeing is, given the uncertainty in the global economy and the loosening of WTO and multilateral discipline, the two things that are going to play for the future of Asian, you said the middle income Asia, or even for India's context, would be whether it is the trade policy that would dominate, or the industrial policy would make its way back into many of the economies that need opening up for further. So, apart from connections, the connection between trade policy and industrial policy, if you have, because I've not read the book, but if there is any discussion on that, I would really appreciate that.
You want to go now? And then take the next lot?
Okay, yes, why not? Because there were so many interesting things there. Okay, that's on. So to Anupam's points, yeah, I agree. Has a different sociology or racial sort of mix up, but I wouldn't actually think that Asia is that homogeneous. I mean, just maybe in India, that seems more striking. But if you look at Indonesia, Southeast Asia, actually many of the business groups are owned, and Thailand, are by Chinese. And this is quite a significant bit of sociology there. I mean, they're very well integrated in the economy, but they also, for instance, the largest family business group in Thailand, the Kiaravanond family, they're of Chinese origin, and a significant part of their contracts and activities in recent years have been bringing Chinese technology, railways and the like, and other projects into Thailand, as well as executing projects in the People's Republic. So, you know, I wouldn't necessarily say that the sociology is totally different. There's less homogeneity than one might think. But I grant your point, and there are different dynamics, different religions, different sort of assumptions, and so on. The socialist systems, well, I mean, I spent ages working on the Soviet Union and Russia and the like, and we see what an appalling state that has landed in, and not least of all because of some very ill-considered measures that people like ourselves, when we were working in the World Bank, proposed and then implemented, notably the way in which assets were privatized and subsequently recombined. But having said that, I mean, Russia remarkably quickly reverted back to something sort of much more feudal than the world we describe here. I mean, where power really emanated from very few places politically and very few industries politically. In other words, it essentially is a game about oil, gas, diamonds, and a few other assets being controlled by the Kremlin and, you know, business groups around it, most of whom are now back in state hands, either explicitly or implicitly. So I think that's a different game. China got, I mean, that's going to take a whole another day to deal with, because it's much more interesting and much more complex.
Let us know when you come next.
But I think our view on China is that they sit on the horns of a massive dilemma, which is the very things that have got so many industries going, and some of them both innovative and dynamic, runs into the political agenda, which is to restrict the room for maneuver of the founders and the management and the like. And you know, if Russia and other places are anything to go by, I mean, invention, which is the soul of innovation, doesn't do very well when you get ordered what to think and the like. And my feeling is that, well, maybe they will work their way out of it, but this is something that drops down from the constraints of the political system, and particularly as it's come to be configured under Mr. Xi. And your point, Anupam, about R&D, I agree with that. I mean, yeah, it's not the best measure, and there's a lot of noise in that. But we didn't have anything much better to do. In fact, innovation is filthily measured, generally speaking, and a lot of these indices have a lot. The interplay with political power, I absolutely grant you. And in fact, my next book is actually on the economics of authoritarianism, and where we're trying to look at how this, and when I'm authoritarianism, I mean from Hungary and Turkey right through to China or indeed to Russia. And so Mr. Kohli's point about shifting to Taiwan, I think, yes, well, you have a choice, and why not then take it? But I think this brings in the bigger issue of trade liberalization, which I haven't mentioned enough about, and is a good criticism of the book. I mean, clearly, trade liberalization can achieve a great deal. You can allow in competitors, and as the South Koreans above all have shown, this can be a tremendous discipline and a spur. But there's a caveat, and which is that a lot of what we describe proceeds in activities that are either non-tradable or in services, or where, although trade barriers may have come down, non-tariff barriers may, and other informal barriers may still be highly important. And so, so there is a limit to, and can IT be used for new startups and financing? Can this free you from the clutches of connections? Well, I think in principle it can, but it obviously depends on how you use it and who's using it. And my guess is that it'll prove to be a very incomplete breaker of those links. On Brazil, rise and fall, I don't know that I know enough. I don't want to really venture there, but I think my point was that I made a bit earlier, and which Brazil most certainly does feed into. The earlier strategies of basing national growth on large state sector and some powerful privately owned business groups ran into the sands quite a long time ago, and the detritus of that lives to the day. I mean, they still have a massive state sector. I mean, probably the biggest drag on the budget are pensions for public sector workers and the like. And many of the business groups, well, a lot have actually shrunk. And the politics turn nasty for some of the reasons that I mentioned more generally. And yeah, trade policy, industrial policy, which will be more dominant. Well, I mean, I think ideally you could probably have both. And I don't mean by that sort of picking winners type industrial policy. I think very few people, sensible people, advocate that. But, bringing sort of means of coordination, infrastructure, and the like. But one feels wary about listening to that when you hear, the man himself or the government suggesting that Mr. Adani is India's answer to the, large-scale infrastructure. So I think these sorts of things that can end up being captured rather quicker than one might imagine.
Thank you. Any burning questions? We're about to come to the end of our time. Yes? Here.
Oh, it's okay. I think I can just say that. Just wondering.
No, microphone. You're hiding the microphone.
Hi, good evening. I'm Nivedita Mukherjee. I'm from the Sunday Garden newspaper. I wanted to know, as India has opened up, looking to trade in Indian rupee. How does that, work for the future of India's economic growth? Is the world really ready to take, the rupee trade on? Because a lot of countries have expressed interest in doing so.
Right.
There was one at the back. Yeah, go ahead.
My name is Mahesh Kushwaha, and my question was whether the book talks about whether these connections travel across borders,
Yes.
and
Okay.
Good one.
Yeah.
if they do, what kind of form does that take?
Yeah.
And I guess a follow-up question to that would be, well, if there is a thing like a connection world that is characteristic of Asia, then what are your arguments against the possibility that the non-Asian world would not adapt to this culture of connections instead of Asia kind of?
Good point.
Thank you.
Thank you. So would you like to answer before I add my another three questions?
Okay, fine, right.
Shankar, would you like to say something? No?
Well, no, that's all very good. For the lady from Sunday Guardian, I think I feel nervous answering that question. I think Rakesh ought to really answer it because he knows so much more about it. I mean, because on exchange rate liberalization, there's a whole issue of the capital account, current account. I mean, there's an endless debate on that, and I don't feel well informed enough to make any prognostication on that. But I mean, I think trade opening, I mean, it's very clear that there have been enormous benefits to this country, and that certainly should be a strategy that is continued to be pursued and broadened. But how that will proceed in the geopolitics, I have no idea, because I mean, if nothing else, you see that in the States, you know, Biden's policy on trade isn't an awful lot different from Trump's policy, and so there are a lot of headwinds. So that's not a very good answer, but that's probably the best I can do at the moment. And on Mahesh's point, which is very interesting, in the book we do chronicle a few examples. The thing about the way connections work is it's very hard to do it in a quantitative sense, because a lot of this is under the counter, as it were, or in an informal way. So you have to do it by picking up stories and the like. And several of the stories we pick up, I alluded to one, for instance, the Chiaravanant family's links to China and the party and that you see right throughout Southeast Asia, the leveraging of that by Chinese diaspora companies, big business groups in Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia, and the like. And there's a case that we bring up which also spills into corruption as well, linking some largely South Indian entrepreneurs with the Malaysians over a bunch of transactions, I think at the fag end of the Mahathir second government or whatever it was. So they definitely do work across borders. And in sort of interviews with businesses, the few that one's done, there's no doubt that when these types of business groups look to transact in other jurisdictions or open up, their natural instinct is always to go towards entities that look like them and operate like them. But, and this is a big but, they know perfectly well from their own behavior that those sorts of entities are not likely to be trustworthy. So they're on the horns of a dilemma always. But having said that, knowing how your partner is going to dance is an awfully good way of predicting their moves. So in general, my suspicion is, not suspicion, I mean it's clear that yes, sort of business groups will, of this type of nature, will try and connect with similar entities rather than more sort of arm's length type arrangements.
Thank you very much, Simon. So just three more comments or questions. Yeah, now it's working. One, and you kind of alluded to some of these. One, would it be the case that one difference between Latin America and Asia, as you define it, is that many of the business leaders, or conglomerates, or whatever you may call them, had origins in being landowners or essentially rentiers. And presumably there, and by the way, that was similarly true in Philippines.
Yeah.
And so their behavior is very different from fellows like Samsung and Co. Or the Japanese conglomerates, who did not have origins in land, partly because land was not that great in any case, and partly because of the post-war major land reforms in these countries. And so they were much more into tradables, and therefore, we alluded to that earlier, and therefore, whatever kind of connections, industrial policy, trade policy, whatever, they were certainly subject to international trade and competition. Where they had to, I mean, either they competed or they sunk, like Daewoo did in Korea. So that's one comment. Second, I'm a little surprised by the employment informality issue. Because from whatever number, I haven't seen them more recently, But whatever numbers I saw, I guess maybe 8 years ago or something on China, that they had more than 100 million people employed in manufacturing in the organized sector, unlike our still 15 million. And we have many more, of course, in the informal sector. So I didn't think that informal employment was true in China, partly because it wasn't allowed for ages. Now I don't know how much it is. But so that I'm a little surprised by. Same thing I would say for Korea. Same thing I would say with Taiwan, but I don't remember their numbers. I certainly do remember the China's numbers 8 years ago. So I'm a little surprised by that. Third, on size actually, the McKinsey Global Institute, usually a reputable organization, and it must be reputable since I'm a senior advisor to them. So, so they so they did a big study about 5 years back, Shishir, or 4 years back on the outperformers. 2018, 5 years back now. And one of the big points they made was that the competitiveness of, quote, the outperformers, which was mostly these countries you're talking about, was really because they had large companies in tradables and exports. The to succeed in exports, in India we've had the fable of the fancy SMEs, but if you look at the whole export market, it's really large firms who dominate across the world, partly for within multinational trade, but also otherwise. So this is a question in the sense that if you have relatively small countries like Korea or Thailand or Vietnam, if you're going to have some size in the companies, there would be a significant share of GDP. I wouldn't say the same for China. So I think that that's an interesting issue. That if you want to get productivity, and also then there also comes to the issue of R&D, which, by the way, we have a question from Zoom. I'll translate the question. The question actually states, why is India's R&D proportion of GDP so low, and what do we need to do to increase it so that we can grow much faster? Although this is from Anil Kumar Kanungo, and he says, what do we have to do to attain a 5 trillion economy? Which is not very far actually, because we already have 3.4 or 3.2 or something like that. But anyway, I'll broaden that question, that on R&D, once again, to have effective R&D, you have to, in the private sector, you have to have large companies, otherwise you can't do it. And of course, profitable. So anyway, I'll stop there. Now you have 2.5 minutes.
Well, that's probably just.
I don't see people running away, so maybe you can take longer.
Well, that point about landowners is fascinating. I mean, you only have to look at your neighbor, Pakistan, to actually understand what the nature, A, of the connections world, and B, of their capitalism is when you see it so configured by those sorts of groups. And yeah, absolutely. And their ability also to protect their interests and to protect their sector is, and that for a variety of reasons, not least of all the war, what wasn't there in South Korea. It's quite interesting, by the way, that I mean, Vietnam is still largely an agricultural economy, and it has a huge agricultural labor force. But for one reason or the other, that has not managed to dominate the policy menu, even if there are elements of protection and the right. The informality numbers are quite high for China. I mean, they may be mismeasured, but I don't find them as surprising as you do. I mean, remember, after all, that most of the Chinese cities, well, in most Chinese large cities, the hukou system still operates. Large numbers of people don't have the permits, therefore they are, they're outside the formal sector. And one bit in the book, which leads back to all the stuff about unemployment and labor markets, is that I still find it tremendously striking that not so much in this country, because of the level of income and the like. But certainly in China, and to some extent even in South Korea, there is such reluctance to move towards more organized forms of social protection, in particular to unemployment insurance. So, I mean, there is some unemployment insurance in China, but it's for a very small number of essentially state-owned enterprise workers. It's just a way of shoehorning them into retirement, actually. But for everyone else, there is nothing other than the family. And before China became rather closed, I went there and we had some quite interesting discussions, at the end of which the people who remain nameless but who were quite high up in the system said, oh, well, we're not in the slightest bit interested in having a modern system of social insurance. We don't want to end up like Europe. And, you know, you can understand some of that argument, but you can't understand all of it. And I think even if it doesn't totally work in China, and it's maybe a little bit obsessive, I think one of the reasons why governments are so loath to move towards arm's length systems of social insurance is they like the discretion that comes from creating jobs and playing God, as it were. And this is a major impediment, and I think will backfire on them. And you're right. Look, on R&D, you need large firms. I mean, it's not a problem. When I refer to the size distribution, I'm not saying, okay, they're large firms. They're actually not enough of them. There should be more, and they should be more competitive with each other. And that's not the issue. I mean, and the size pyramid is just occupied by too many really not very well performing countries. And yes, small economies may need larger companies. I can see it, the argument runs that way. I guess a lot depends on what endowments they have and also what sort of skills they're investing in. And what would it do to take India to do R&D and innovate more and the like? Well, we were discussing it over lunch and it was something of a mystery. But my guess is that one of the main, in the book, we really, in the innovation space, we highlight 3 places that are both have more innovation in a way now and much more potential: India, China, and South Korea. And in India's case, the main limits, I think we find, are to do with skills and education and the complementary infrastructure. But there are other issues that Rakesh raised over lunch about, for instance, the inoperability or the failure to use tax incentives effectively to get greater innovations. And there are lots of issues there that I don't think I want to try and answer at this moment.
Thank you. Shankar, you want to...
I just wanted to add to what
Yeah.
Simon just said about land in China. Actually, the use of all land being state-owned and the use of land for development, I think in China is unique. I don't think you can compare that with the experience across the rest of Asia. And I think that factor, I think, needs a whole separate
But it's
book.
state land.
But all land is state.
Yeah, so
in China.
There's no
So-
rentiers from the land. There is no land.
No, but you can, because the right to use, you end up a rentier. And so usufruct rather than... So it's a bit more complicated. But on employment, you know, they've had 220 million migrant labor in the labor force. Now that's without hukou, without the rights. I mean, that's informal. And now you're talking about 22% unemployment among people below the age of 30. So you have, again, a much more complicated situation today for Chinese employment than I think you've ever known before. And Xi's reaction is to tighten control and regulate. I'm not sure how that's going to work. So I think we're dealing now with a very different set of... So what you said is true, you know, the role of these very large firms, because these firms have actually grown on the backs of the informal employment structures and have a vested interest in maintaining it in China. And not just in China, across the board. But that's a relationship that is maybe worth examining in your next book. About
but actually
labor with and business groups.
But just very quickly on, I think I've popped it on that. That's absolutely true. Right through Asia, many of the larger companies use informal labor for outsourced purposes or subcontracting. There's massive amounts of subcontracting, and why not? It's cheap and very few obligations.
Thank you very much. Just one last comment on R&D actually. On top of the skills, one thing that's very interesting and strange is that I have not studied this, but the people who have are now giving very large numbers of multinational firms, mostly Western, who have huge R&D operations in India with all Indian engineers, scientists, etc., but not Indian firms. So I do have a friend who was first in a very large Indian pharmaceutical company. Now his business is running contract research organizations, and he's in pharmaceuticals. And he says all the contracts are from foreign firms. None, even though we are doing well in pharmaceuticals, even the large Indian pharmaceutical firms are not giving him any contracts to do R&D. So that's a big puzzle, but numbers. I mean, the one who looked at is Naushad Forbes, actually. He tells me that. So,
Disproportionate, most of that is clinical.
Whatever it is.
So, but that is like, it's like a particular form of.
Whatever it is. But the point is, Indian firms are not doing it. It's included in the R&D numbers. And it's interesting that Indian firms are not even doing that. So anyway, that was just on pharmaceuticals, but this is in all kinds of activities actually. So I don't have the numbers, but that is something that is very interesting, that this seems to be not a problem of skills. But again, I'm just saying a hearsay actually. Good. So it just remains for me to thank you, Simon, for taking all the time. I hope that this is the best session you've had on the 13 that you've had in the world.
Of course.
And Shankar, thank you so much for, to some extent, coming out of your comfort zone, and which is why we had you here, to give us some different perspective, actually. Chaps like us will keep saying the same thing.
I was educated.
Yeah, thank you. So I think I was certainly educated. So thank you very much again.
Thank you.